Okay, so last we left off looking at the process of implantation starting with that little blastocyst trying to find a place, and the trophoblast specifically starting to release enzymes to digest some of mom's endometrium. Now remember, this is just the size of a large but single cell. And so there's not going to be any bleeding or probably any way that mom's going to feel this event occurring as we look at this, okay? Said where you implant does matter. In 1 to 2% of the cases, it's outside the uterus, and we call this ectopic. Probably the most common is tubal pregnancy. Sometimes even within the uterus, we have a problem. So if you aren't going to support growth, such as the opening of the cervix, right over the cervix, as I show you here, we call that placenta previa. Right. So here is the preferred. And we have a model to show that's for growth. And we are quite a bit advanced here, so let's go back to where we left off, okay? So the blastocyst, again, is digesting away, especially the trophoblast, and moving in. The endometrium is growing over it. So we are completely in the endometrial wall, and we're going to grow out, which is why we are now going to be considered sterile. And we want to keep this embryo nice and protected in that manner. All right? So I mentioned on the previous video that the trophoblast makes this hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, because again, the structure of the trophoblast, the chorion is going to come from that. So HCG is actually the hormone, right? It targets or influences the gonads, and the gonads are the ovaries. So what is it causing the ovaries to do? Well, it's causing the ovaries to maintain the corpus luteum. Because remember, the corpus luteum is producing, right, estrogen and progesterone, and we're going to add relaxin here. And these levels need to remain high, or, right, we could see spasms in the myometrium, and we could shed the endometrium. And if we do that, we're going to, right, lose that little embryo. So we need to really calm the uterus, right? So I say estrogen and progesterone stimulate and maintain the uterine lining, so they keep the endometrium intact. They inhibit the development of additional follicles, yeah, because you don't want to conceive once you have conceived, right? And they inhibit the contractions of the myometrium, and they gradually begin enlarging reproductive organs through the pregnancy. This hormone relaxin, which is also produced by the corpus luteum, will help progesterone, right, inhibit uterine contractions, and later on in the pregnancy it will relax some of the collagen that is contributing to the pelvic ligaments, so that the right coxa can be spread for delivery. So here we are with implantation proceeding along. So here's the endometrium shown here, and of course we're completely covered in this. We're divvying up, right, the trophoblast is forming several different layers that I'm not going to ask you guys to know. There's lots of cool words that go with development, but you know, we only have so much time. So it's burrowing in, it's getting situated. We see in the midst of all these embryonic cells, there is an embryonic disc. So again, remember, this all did come from the single zygote, but now we've divided up our tasks. So the trophoblast is going to become, right, what we call the extra embryonic structures, like the chorion and the amnion and the yolk sac and allotois, right? And then the embryonic disc is going to continue dividing and producing more cells, and pretty soon we're going to have some different tissues, right? So right now we just talk about the hypoblast and the epiblast as structures or cells, collective cells, in what is known as the embryo. You also see here's the amnion. They've kind of color coded this nicely. So this is going to continue to develop and grow around this embryo. And we've got this space that is considered the yolk sac here. So the embryo itself is being really kind of cushioned between these two extra embryonic membranes. All right? And we'll look to see that continue to develop. All right, so here's focusing just on those extra embryonic membranes. We see, again, kind of color code, the yolk sac. So as I said, cells from the hypoblast continue dividing, right, producing more cells, and the cells can now do different things. So the yolk sac forms from these cells, and we see that they give rise, right, give rise to blood cells, sex cells, and some parts of the digestive tract and umbilicus. The allantois, which is not evident yet here, said it forms around the 3rd week, and we're not there yet. This is really the second. We're in the 2nd week of development. Is a tube from the yolk sac, so the yolk sac will keep growing, expanding, and eventually it's going to hit a point where it starts shrinking. Okay, but at this point, the allantois will develop from that, and the allantois will become parts of the bladder and part of the umbilicus as well. So the embryo itself, right? So here we are coming back to this embryo. Here's the amniotic cavity that's going to keep moving and surrounding you. Here's again this nice yolk sac that's going to eventually shrink down. And then here we have basically what's going to become the chorion itself that we're just identifying as a trophoblast. All right, so I say by the end of the 2nd week, the 2-layered disc becomes a 3-layered disc. All right, so we go from this to this. Right, at the end of the 2nd week, we now have an additional layer. All right, and so we're not going to call this the epiblast and hypoblast anymore. We're going to refer to this as the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. So the ectoderm is going to be your really dorsal area, and the amnion will be surrounding that. And then the endoderm is going to be the innermost layer, and it's really being surrounded by the yolk sac. Though remember, the yolk sac is going to shrink here in a little bit. All right, we do call, when you have 3 evident tissue layers that we call germ layers, we say you are a gastrula, right? And this is really the point where these cells are really becoming determined. And so in other words, if I remove a cell from here, it's not going to become anything in the body. So if I take it from the endoderm, it's probably going to become, cells related to the digestive tract, respiratory tract, or innermost parts of my body, right? So I mentioned here that 2 new layers from the primitive streak form from a primitive streak, and this is showing you this idea of a primitive streak. I won't ask you what that is, but it's an indentation that begins to form and as these cells continue to divide and migrate, right? And displaces that hypoblast, so we no longer refer to this as a hypoblast. And the cells of the epiblast that remain are called the ectoderm. So again, there's a lot of information in here, and there's a lot to know about development, so I'm really just want you to understand that you've got 3 evident germ layers, and that these germ layers are going to become specific structures as development proceeds. Right? And that's what we mentioned here. Your fate depends on the layer you're in. So this is really the important part of all this, is what does the ectoderm give rise to, mesoderm, and endoderm. And so this is a nice cartoon to look at the, again, the fates of these. The endoderm layer, becoming the digestive system, liver, pancreas, lungs, the innermost parts. The mesoderm is the stuff in between, skeletal and muscular. And then the ectoderm is our outermost nervous system, skin, and integument. So they're showing you this idea again. They show this starting to move out into the uterine cavity here in white. We've got now the yolk sac that's going to start shrinking. The amnion has been expanding, and the umbilicus is forming. We see the allantois as part of the umbilicus, right? And the chorion is the outermost around everything, okay? So how do we maintain all this change and numbers of cells increasing all the time? I say, well, in the first few weeks, it's the endometrial glands we mentioned, right? The uterine glands and the blood, and mom's blood. From weeks 4 to 12, the placenta will take over, right? And the placenta, just to let you know, is a temporary organ that is unique because it's made from 2 separate individuals, right? It's part of mom's endometrium, and it's part of the chorion that the embryo has put together, right, made. And this is going to act as a filter, and it's going to allow the exchange of nutrients from mom's blood into baby's blood, or the embryo and fetus blood. And then the waste from the embryo fetal blood will move back into mom's circulation. There isn't a direct contact between the blood of mom and baby. It is completely, right, separate. So the chorion forms these really dense and long finger-like so-called chorionic villi, and they are surrounded really by maternal blood. So they're saying here, this is the lacunae, and that's where there'd be all this blood that's coming from these vessels, right? And then so nutrients diffuse in and waste diffuses out. Nutrients are carried by the umbilical vein, and waste is carried by the umbilical arteries. Usually it's one vein and two arteries. That's pretty standard. Okay. We, again, still need to talk about, all the different parts. The yolk sac continues to shrink here. We're in the very early stages of placenta, and the amnion has expanded, so the baby's completely surrounded by that. All right. Again, mom's part, as I mentioned already, of the placenta is from the endometrium. It's known as decidua and the embryonic part are cells of the trophoblast that form the chorionic membrane, right? And they surround the entire conceptus, so this is all chorion surrounding here, and it just stays thick here. And the projections are called the chorionic villi, as I mentioned, and they remain in pretty firm contact there with the endometrium. And this is how we're going to provide nutrition, excretion, endocrine, all the additional hormones, because the corpus luteum is going to die here eventually. And respiration, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. All right. So I mentioned here, as that placenta is forming and getting established, the cells just keep on dividing and migrating, right? So by the 4th week of development, and here this is just a cut through the folding embryo, right? And the arrows show time. So you start to see everything organized around neural tissue, and neural tissue, right, is coming from the ectoderm. And we're going to form a neural tube. That's where we talk about the neural tube defects, and that'll form underneath as these cells, right, they pinch off, right, they start to invaginate and they form, fuse together, and you find the neural tube, which is really going to organize the central nervous system. And then the ectoderm is still surrounding, right, part of the skin and sensory. All right, so by the 4th week, the disc becomes a tube, right, so flattened disc becomes a tube. The neural tube forms from ectoderm. We call this neurulation. From the mesoderm, you get these block-like somites, all right? So when we look at these, right, this is coming from, again, they kind of color code this, from the mesoderms. These blocks are going to give rise to various bones and groups of muscle, as well as the dermis of the integument, right? In the 4th and 5th week, the anterior neural tube dilates, so you start to get a brain. So we start to see and can tell a head from a tail about the 4th week, so about a month after conception. And this talks about the terms like the notochord is this embryonic tube. That's a term for that collectively. And this would, right, this notochord is going to go away. So this notochord shown here and here is going to go away in us, but it's also, right, going to remain as part of these intervertebral discs between the individual vertebra. So, interesting. Doesn't look quite like what you expect, but like I said, it's a little imagination here. So the embryo begins folding laterally and at the ends. So again, we're starting to see a head or cephalic region and a caudal or tail region. And this is just a cross section through again to remind you what, or transverse section to remind you what it looks like. And this is a sagittal. So the yolk sac is completely shrunk down to just remain as parts of the gut or digestive tract. And they're still color coding the ectoderm and mesoderm here to try to keep the parts straight for you. So again, the embryo envelops that yolk sac, creates a primitive gut lined by the endoderm that you see here. The amniotic sac, which was on top of flat embryo, surrounds it as it folds. So we don't see that really well here because we're looking just at this idea of what's going on with the embryo, right? And that's our neural tube. So, but here we're kind of given this idea that this amnion is continuing to fold and surround this embryo, right? And organs start to appear from the 3 layers, the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm, and we refer to this as organogenesis. Just to complete this video, here's an actual photograph about this time, right? Just a little bit more advanced. The heart starts as a tube. It begins beating in the 4th week, and by the 5th week, the liver produces blood cells, and the heart circulating them. In the 6th week, the GI system, limb buds, and digits, which we're not quite there yet, right? And in the 7th week, you would see facial features, ears, nose, eyes, and in the 8th week, brain structures would be in place, and that would end the embryonic period.